Somewhere between finishing a book and actually being able to use what's in it, most people lose almost everything. Not because the material was too advanced, not because they weren't smart enough to grasp it, they lose it because nobody ever taught them how learning actually works. 15 years in a classroom, and not one of those years is spent explaining what the brain needs in order to hold on to information instead of letting it slide right back out. You know the feeling already. You close a book or finish a course and think, this time it's stuck. A few weeks pass, someone asks you to explain it, and there's almost nothing there. That gap isn't a sign that you're not built for learning. It's a sign that you've been using the wrong method the whole time, and the method is fixable. Long before universities looked anything like they do now, people were teaching themselves the skills that made them extraordinary. Leonardo da Vinci had no formal training in anatomy when he started dissecting bodies to understand how muscles moved. Nikola Tesla built working models of alternating current systems in his head before he ever touched the equipment. Albert Einstein was doing his best thinking as a patent clerk, years before any university handed him a title that matched what he already understood. None of them followed a curriculum. What they had was a set of habits that modern researchers would later study, name, and confirm in laboratories. This video walks through 8 of those habits and closes with something none of these historical figures ever had: a way to turn artificial intelligence into a private tutor for every single one of them. To keep this concrete, we'll follow one story the whole way through. Ethan taught himself woodworking off videos and forums. No design school, no apprenticeship under anyone. A year in, he takes his first serious commission, a dining table for a client who's paying real money and expecting a professional result. 2 days before delivery, he leans on the finished table to check the joint, and it gives, just slightly, a small crack along the seam that shouldn't be there. He spends that night in his garage under one bad light bulb trying to figure out why, and he can't actually explain it. He knows the steps he followed. He doesn't know why one joint holds and another doesn't. He delivers the table a day late, patched, and sits in the client's kitchen trying to explain what happened, and what comes out of his mouth is, "It should have worked," which is not an explanation, it's an apology. That night changes how he studies, and we'll come back to him after every technique on this list. Here's a belief almost everyone holds without ever questioning it. Reading something twice means you know it better the second time. Try this instead. Pick something you learned recently and try to explain it out loud, from memory, with nothing in front of you. Not a summary, the real mechanism. Give it a few seconds right now. Most people get partway through and stall. The explanation gets vague exactly where the real understanding should be. That stall is the entire point, and it's the same stall Ethan hit trying to explain his own joint. He had watched the same tutorial 5 times. He could follow along with it perfectly. He had never once tried to reproduce it from memory with the video turned off, so he never found out, until a table cracked in front of a paying client, that following along and actually knowing are 2 completely different things. Researchers at Yale ran something close to this exact test using everyday objects, bicycles, zippers, toilet mechanisms, and the pattern held every time. People rated their understanding high right up until they tried to explain it out loud, at which point confidence collapsed. That's exactly what a study at Washington University in St. Louis caught in a more controlled setting. 2 groups studied identical material. One group reread it several times. The other closed the material and forced themselves to recall it from memory, checking afterward what they'd missed. A week later, the group that had simply reread performed noticeably worse, even though during the study session itself it felt the opposite way entirely. The rereaders felt confident because the material was familiar and smooth. The recall group felt frustrated because pulling a fact out of your own head with nothing to lean on is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is usually the exact sign that something is actually being learned, not the sign that something is going wrong. After the table, Ethan stopped rewatching tutorials on repeat. He'd watch something once, close it, and try to explain the joint out loud before checking whether he'd gotten it right. The first few times, he barely got past the opening sentence. Pull the information out of your own head instead of pouring it back in. That's the whole shift, and almost everything else on this list builds on top of it. Now here's a number worth sitting with. Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German researcher working in the late 1800s, ran memory experiments on himself for years, testing exactly how fast new information fades without review. What he mapped is called the forgetting curve, and it's steep. Left alone, most new information loses the majority of its detail within the first day or 2, and then the rate of decay slows down considerably, which means the 2 or 3 days after you learn something aren't a safe buffer. They're the window where almost everything is at risk of disappearing, and most people spend that exact window doing nothing at all, assuming the knowledge will just sit there waiting for them. Airline training programs are built around this on purpose. Emergency procedures aren't taught once and left alone. They're deliberately revisited right as the memory would otherwise be fading, not the next morning, not 2 months later, time to hit the exact point where forgetting is about to take over. That timing is why a pilot can execute a procedure they haven't physically practiced in months without hesitating. It was never about total hours spent reviewing. It was about which moment you chose to review in. Ethan started testing himself on each joint a few days after learning it, right as the details started to blur in his head, then stretched the gap a little further each time he could still recall it. The knowledge stopped feeling borrowed and started feeling like his own. There's a belief that feels obviously true and turns out to be almost backwards, that you should master one skill completely before mixing in another, the way you'd finish one subject in school before starting the next. Researchers tested this directly, giving 2 groups a set of geometry problems on different solid shapes. One group practiced each shape type in a clean block, several cone problems, then cylinders, then spheres, one at a time. The other group mixed every shape together in random order. Tested afterward on new problems, the isolated practice group scored around 20%. The mixed group scored around 63%, same amount of practice time, over 3 times the result. Isolated practice tells you what kind of problem you're facing before you've even read it, so your brain never has to practice recognizing anything, only solving what's already labeled. Mixed practice forces recognition and solving together, which is the actual skill required the moment real life hands you a problem with no chapter title attached. Ethan stopped isolating skills into clean practice blocks and started mixing joinery, measuring, and finishing problems in the same afternoon, forcing himself to identify what kind of challenge he was even looking at before he could start solving it. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What actually separates a master from a beginner? Not raw talent, as it turns out. In the 1970s, a researcher named Adrian de Groot showed chess masters a real position from an actual game for a few seconds, and they reconstructed almost the entire board from memory. It looked like extraordinary recall, until he showed the same masters a board with pieces scattered at random, arrangements that could never occur in a real game, for the same brief window. Their advantage nearly disappeared. They performed barely better than amateurs. They weren't memorizing squares. They were recognizing patterns they'd seen countless times across real games, storing whole clusters as single mental units instead of dozens of separate pieces, something researchers call chunking. That library of patterns only builds after sustained, concentrated time inside one domain, which is the piece interleaving alone can't replace. This is what's actually hiding behind the idea of raw genius. Da Vinci's instinct for anatomy, Tesla's sense for how current would behave before he ever tested it, none of it was a gift they were simply born with. It was thousands of hours inside one field, long enough for their minds to build structures a beginner hasn't earned yet. Go back to the bicycle question for a second, because this next part is where it actually gets used, not just noticed. Pick something you learned recently and explain it out loud to someone who knows nothing about it. Not a summary, a real, full explanation. Ethan tried this on himself before starting his next commission, recording himself explaining each joint aloud, refusing to stop or restart when he stumbled. The explanation would flow fine for a while, and then hit a spot where he was defining a term using the term itself, the exact sign that he'd recognize something without ever truly understanding it. Explaining out loud exposes precisely the gaps that silent reading lets you glide past without noticing, because silence never forces you to actually produce anything. Here's something most people never factor into their studying at all. What happens while they're asleep? Sleep research going back decades, much of it out of institutions like Harvard Medical School, shows that certain stages of sleep aren't downtime for the brain, they're active replay, where the day's learning gets reorganized, strengthened in the places that matter, and quietly trimmed where it doesn't. Which is part of why an all-nighter tends to leave so little behind afterward, even when the total study hours matched a well-rested week almost exactly. Ethan noticed this without knowing the research behind it. A joint that felt shaky the evening he practiced it often felt noticeably more natural the next morning, not because he'd touched it again, but because his brain had kept working on it while he was asleep. Ask yourself something honest. How often do you actually question why something is true versus just accepting it because it's written down? Researchers have a name for the alternative, elaborative interrogation, which is a complicated label for a simple habit, asking why at every step instead of accepting a fact as given. Why does this joint hold more weight than that one? Why does the grain direction change the answer? Studies on this method consistently find that learners who question the reasoning behind new information, tying it to what they already know, hold on to it far longer than learners who absorb facts as isolated statements to be memorized later. A fact with no reason attached sits in memory like an item with nothing to hook onto. A fact you had to justify yourself tends to stay anchored. Ethan started forcing himself to answer a why question after every new technique before moving to the next one, and the ones he could explain in his own words were the ones still in his hands months later without a manual anywhere nearby. Imagine hiring a pilot who has read every aviation manual ever published, cover to cover, and has never once landed a plane. You wouldn't get on that flight, no matter how many books they'd finished. That's exactly what knowledge looks like when it's never been applied to something real. A small business once failed before it really began because its founder had absorbed an enormous amount of theory, strategy books, case studies, frameworks, all of it, without ever applying a single piece to a live decision until the stakes were already high and the mistakes were already expensive. Applying a concept to a real project forces you into the problems theory conveniently leaves out, the edge cases, the ambiguity, the moment two ideas that made sense separately suddenly contradict each other under real conditions. Ethan didn't just study furniture design in the abstract after that first cracked table. He kept building, kept selling, took a loss on a second piece before he ever turned a real profit, and every project surfaced a problem no tutorial or forum post had warned him about. The project was never a reward for having learned something. It was the process that actually turned information into a skill he could stand behind. Pull it all together and the shift is simple, even if the list feels long. Pull information out of your head instead of pouring it back in. Review right before you'd forget, not after. Mix your practice instead of isolating it into clean blocks. Stay long enough in one field for real pattern recognition to form. Explain out loud to expose what silent reading hides. Protect your sleep, because part of the learning happens after you close your eyes. Ask why instead of accepting facts as given, and apply everything to something real before assuming you actually know it. None of this needed a university. Da Vinci, Tesla, and Einstein ran on these habits by instinct long before a laboratory existed to explain why any of them worked. Now picture an excellent private tutor, available at 3 in the morning if you needed them, who quizzed you the moment you got too comfortable, brought concepts back right before you'd forget them, mixed your practice automatically, pushed you to explain out loud, questioned your reasoning at every step, and reminded you to sleep on it before you trusted that you'd mastered anything. That access has never existed for most people. It exists now if you know exactly what to ask for, and most people don't, which is the actual gap this next part closes. Here's the honest caveat first, because this deserves skepticism rather than a smooth pitch. Asking an AI tool to summarize an entire book for you in 10 seconds teaches you almost nothing, and it creates the exact same illusion this video opened with. You feel informed. You are not the same as someone who worked through the material themselves. It's the bicycle problem again, dressed up in a newer interface. The tool was never the variable that mattered. What you ask it to do is. So ask it to do something specific instead. For retrieval practice, instead of summarize this chapter, try telling it, don't explain this to me. Quiz me on it, one question at a time, and don't move to the next question until I've actually gotten this one right. For spaced repetition, tell it, track what I've told you I learned this week, and bring each thing back to me a few days later without warning, the way a real review schedule would. For interleaving, tell it, mix questions from the last 3 things I've studied into the same session. Don't group them by topic. For the explaining out loud technique, this is the one worth using the most. Act as a strict tutor. I'm going to explain this concept to you out loud. Interrupt me the moment my explanation gets vague or I start repeating a word without defining it. For elaborative interrogation, try. Every time I state something as fact, ask me why it's true before letting me move on. Each of these turns a generic assistant into a version of the specific habit that actually built the result, instead of a shortcut that only feels like progress. There's one more use worth mentioning because it runs against how most people think to use these tools at all. In 1979, researchers at Stanford ran a study on people with strong opposing opinions about the death penalty, showing both groups the same mixed evidence. Instead of updating their views, both sides read the identical data as further proof they'd been right all along, a pattern known as motivated reasoning, and it isn't limited to controversial topics. It shows up anywhere someone already feels confident. Try telling an AI tool, "Argue the strongest possible case against what I just said, even if you think I'm right. Don't be agreeable." That single instruction turns the tool into something most people never think to ask for, a partner built specifically to disagree with you well. None of this replaces years of hands-on experience, a real mentor, or a credential where one is genuinely required, and it's worth staying skeptical of anyone claiming a chatbot alone can substitute for that. What it replaces is the access problem. The habits that made history's most self-taught minds exceptional were always available to anyone willing to apply them with real discipline. What was never available was a tireless partner willing to quiz you at 3 in the morning, track your forgetting curve automatically, and argue against your own assumptions the moment you asked it to. That partner exists now. The techniques never changed. The access finally has. There's something strange about this exact moment. It has never been easier to feel informed about something, and it has rarely been rarer to actually understand anything deeply enough to defend it under real pressure. A diploma was never proof of understanding. At best, it was proof of exposure, evidence someone sat in a room where the material was presented to them. It never proved they could rebuild it from memory, apply it under uncertainty, or hold up when someone actively tried to poke holes in it. Ethan, standing in a client's kitchen with an apology instead of an explanation, the chess masters whose advantage disappeared the second a position stopped looking familiar, the founder who finally stopped reading theory and started building something real, losses and all, every one of them hit the same wall, the gap between recognizing something and being able to reproduce it when it actually mattered, and every one of them got past it the same way, not by absorbing more information, but by changing their relationship to the information they already had. Da Vinci filled notebooks with sketches he'd redraw from memory until the mechanics made sense without a reference in front of him. Tesla ran entire machines through his head before ever touching a wrench. Einstein pictured himself riding alongside a beam of light long before the mathematics existed to justify what he was picturing. None of them had this list written down anywhere. They arrived at it the hard way, in eras with no laboratory to confirm any of it, and no tutor waiting at 3 in the morning to speed the process along. So take the last thing you told yourself you'd learned, a book, a course, a skill you assumed you had down. How much of it could you actually explain right now, out loud, with no notes, to someone who knows absolutely nothing about it?